Right. Hey, everyone. Welcome for another Dapr community call. We're here at number 103, actually. It's May 15th. And hi, I'm Mark Duiker. And we have also Cecil Philip here.
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
We're both the Dapr community managers. And we have one guest today who will give like 2 sessions. Let me quickly share my screen so we can have a look at the agenda. Here we go. So Philip Hoff will join us. I will also add him already right now. Hi, Philip. Welcome.
Hello.
And well, you're going to give us 2 sessions. Thank you very much. First, like an intro to the Dapr.net SDK repo and architecture, because this is part of like a whole series that we want to make. We want to create some video material for new contributors. So you're actually going to be the first one that's going to do like a session to explain the Dapr.net SDK. But there will be like more sessions for all of the different SDKs and also the components and probably also the runtime at a certain point. So yeah, in hopefully like a couple of months, we would like to have like a whole collection of all kinds of videos that can be useful for people new to Dapr, that clearly explain them how to contribute to many of the Dapr repositories. And then the second session will be about the Dapr Visual Studio extension. So you've done like an intro to that already, like a couple of community calls ago, but some things have changed. So you give us an update there as well. And we're going to end with the regular show and tell, where we show what the Dapr community has been created, like videos and written stuff, and the things that we have found on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And please, if you just joined, let us know where you come from. It's always nice to know. And if you have any questions, please write them in the comments. And either Philip, if you see them, you can feel free to answer them right away. But otherwise, there's going to be like a quick Q&A after each of the session where we just highlight some of the questions.
All right.
Okay, I will stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing. Go.
Yeah, and then while you're doing that, for folks that are watching, if you have any questions at all for Philip, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the comments. Mark and I are going to be taking a look at the comments. And, whenever we get a chance, we'll make sure that, we'll try and get your questions answered for you live on the community call today.
All right, let's see if this will work.
I'm crossing my fingers. hopefully we don't have any problems.
Let me not be able to. All right, let's see if this works. All right.
Right.
There we go. Great. So my name is Philip Hoff. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I've been part of the Dapr team for the last 1.5 years, although for a couple of years I've been involved in some way with the Dapr product in terms of the tooling, such as the VS Code extension for Dapr and so on. At the moment, I'm one of the maintainers for the Dapr.net SDK, and I wanted to just briefly review the Dapr.net SDK today. We won't go into too many details, but we just want to cover some of the basics so that you can sort of, if you're interested in contributing, bug fixing, adding new features to the Dapr.net SDK, we absolutely encourage that. But we want you to feel comfortable and know how to go about making changes to the SDK. Let's start with just kind of a brief overview of the .NET SDK itself. Obviously, it's a series of .NET libraries for interacting with services via the Dapr sidecar. We'll just spend a little bit of time just to kind of refresh our memories about how Dapr works. So you've got your service, we'll just call it Service A. It's a .NET service, probably ASP.NET. It's making use of the Dapr.net SDK. There's actually several SDKs. We'll talk about the specifics of those in the next one. But you'll use one or more of the Dapr.net SDK NuGet packages, reference those from your service, and those will communicate with the Dapr sidecar that's running side by side your service, either over HTTP or gRPC, depending on which particular set of calls you're using. And then the Dapr sidecar will then proxy those calls to the ultimate location. So if you're making a service invocation, you're calling service B from service A through Dapr. You're making calls often through HTTP. The Dapr sidecar then proxies those to the corresponding Dapr sidecar for service B, typically over gRPC. And then that sidecar will then make a call back into service B. Again, either over HTTP or gRPC, depending on how it's configured. Service B then responds, and then the response goes back through the series of sidecars back to service A, and then service A manages it. So there's a lot of sort of indirection, but that's all hidden from you when you're using the SDK. Obviously, you don't have to use the SDK to make calls to the Dapr sidecar. You can just make HTTP calls directly if you wish. That's always an option. The SDK makes a number of things easier for .NET developers, and so it's generally recommended. If you're making calls to, say, PubSub, state store, input-output bindings, the components that handle those calls are hosted within the Dapr sidecar process itself. So again, you use the Dapr SDK. Oh, the cursor shows up. There we go. Those calls go across typically gRPC and then get handled by the component that you're making calls to, and then those go, say, to the backend Redis database, SQL, whatever PubSub backend you're using, and so on, and then make their way also back to the service. Say if you're managing subscriptions to PubSub topics, then those will go back across from the sidecar to your service. So as far as the Dapr.NET SDK goes, it's an open source library hosted on GitHub, MIT licensed. No, not MIT licensed, sorry. And published on the individual packages are published on NuGet. At the moment, we target .NET 6 and 8, as those are the LTS versions of .NET currently. .NET 7, there's one case where we specifically target that. I think that's in the workflow library. But of course, you might have noticed that actually went out of support this week. So you can expect that in future versions of the .NET libraries, we'll probably deprecate that specific target. And then as .NET 6 is coming up for running out of support later this year, in favor of .NET 8. And then so in probably a couple of releases thereafter, we'll deprecate .NET 6 support, and then add in .NET 9 as necessary in whichever version is next. So again, we publish the Dapr.NET SDK with each Dapr runtime release, so 1.11, 1.12, 1.13 as they come out. But there's no specific tie to the Dapr runtime. We can publish releases whenever we really need to or want to, so we can publish fixes and so on independently. So don't let the release schedule stop you from wanting to add new features or things like that. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about Dapr. So here's the Dapr.NET SDK. We've actually what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the libraries. So we have a whole bunch of libraries that comprise the Dapr.NET SDK. We have the sorry. The core one is Dapr.Client. So this is the main way for applications to interact with the Dapr sidecar. So this has the Dapr client type itself, which has a whole bunch of methods. Probably it's not super well partitioned. That's mostly a historical thing. But it allows you to make calls for service invocation, for PubSub, for making calls to input and output bindings, and so on. So this can be used independently of services. So if you just have console application, worker process, you can use the Dapr.client to interact with the Dapr sidecar that way. If you're actually hosting services that make use of Dapr in some way in ASP.NET, there's the Dapr.ASP.NET Core library that sits on top of that. This adds registration types for doing things like being able to make use of the Dapr client via dependency injection, things of that nature, being able to subscribe to PubSub, so it has those registration methods, configuring cloud events and so on. So typically, if you're using ASP.NET to host a service that makes use of Dapr, you'll reference that library. There's a set of libraries related to use of Dapr actors. So again, there's kind of a client library for applications that are making use of or communicating with actors. That's Dapr.actors, has the base client libraries for creating proxies to those actor implementations and actor instances and making calls to them. Again, if you're actually hosting actors within your ASP.NET application, you'd make use of the Dapr actors ASP.NET Core library. That allows you to register your actor implementation, which then the Dapr sidecar uses in order to know how to direct calls being made to actor instances to your particular service. New in 1.13 is actually a third actor-related library. That's Dapr.actors.generators. So we might talk a little bit about actors, but there's sort of two main ways that you can implement actors. One is through a .NET specific sort of strongly typed remoting kind of proxy, where you use strongly typed interfaces, and then the service uses that to make calls from your application to that backend actor implementation using sort of a custom binary interface, which works great. It allows you to do things like have multiple arguments per method, things like that. Makes it very natural to use. The downside is that it's very specific to .NET. So if you're a .NET client and you want to talk to a Java or Python or Go implementation of an actor, you can't do that through that particular interface. You have to use this sort of secondary interface, and that's what we call the loosely typed actor proxy. And it has its limitations. The main advantage is that you can talk to any of the actor implementations. The downside is that you can't. One of the downsides is that there's only one. You can only pass one method. Everything's loosely typed. So in .NET, it's not necessarily super easy to work with. The Dapr.actors.generators allows you to basically put a strongly typed interface around loosely typed actor proxies, which allow you to make use of and call actors as if they were strongly typed, even though they aren't. Which sort of gives you maybe the best of both worlds in some cases, where you can, from your client, you can make calls in a strongly typed way, but you can actually make calls to backends that are implemented in non.NET platforms. All right. Dapr has a concept of configuration and secret components that you can make use of, but ASP.NET also has a very sophisticated infrastructure for aggregating configuration and environment settings into one sort of coherent configuration type system. And so it's often useful to be able to combine ASP.NET's notion of configuration with Dapr's notion of configuration and secrets. That's all done through the Dapr.extension.configuration library. It basically allows Dapr to plug into ASP.NET's configuration infrastructure and expose configuration and secrets as part of that. So you don't necessarily need to do that as a second thing after startup. It's just sort of all becomes ambient configuration and lets the application sort of work in a more ASP.NET centric way. And then finally, there's Dapr.workflow. So this is the library for interacting and implementing Dapr workflows. So if you're an ASP.NET or really any .NET application that wants to implement workflows, you would reference this library. You'd also reference it to interact with workflows and actually At the moment, those two things are one and the same. In other words, you can only interact with workflows from the application that's actually hosting that particular workflow itself, which is sort of a common thing that comes up. All right. I don't see any questions yet, but we'll go on to see if we can set the screen. Bring this up again. There we go. Oh, for my goodness. Hold on a moment. Oh no. All right. At the moment, Chrome will not let me share anymore, which is nice.
I know that happens sometimes.
All right, let me try again.
Right, but in the meantime, folks, again, if you have any questions for Philip, let us know. Philip, I'm a big fan of the Dapr.NET SDK. I might be a little bit biased. I use .NET quite a bit. One of the things I like about it, and one of the things I like about Dapr in general, is that I always feel like it's more of an option than a requirement, right? And I feel that's kind of like a theme all throughout Dapr, right? Like I can use the SDK, but I don't have to use the SDK. Kind of like I can use certain components, but I don't have to use all the components. And I think that's one of the great things I love about like how, we can set things up with Dapr, right? Like everything is optional. So you can kind of pick and choose how and when you want to use things. And even as you were showing us all those different options for, there's an actor SDK and there's the workflows SDK and so on and so forth, right? Like you can pick and choose your pieces, because a question I often get from folks is, oh, do I have to use all of this? Like, which one do I install? Like, what am I supposed to do? And my question is usually, well, what do you want to do? Like, what are you trying to achieve? And then based on that, like, we can kind of make some decisions about like the dependencies that you bring into your application.
That's exactly right. We can, you can sort of pick and choose exactly which pieces of Dapr you want to make use of. Like I said, you don't have to use the Dapr.NET SDK at all. If you're more comfortable using straight HTTP calls, HTTP client, you can totally do that. Sometimes it makes sense to do that if you have an existing application that you just want to sort of add Dapr to, but you don't want to necessarily take a dependency on Dapr because you're just maybe not entirely sure about it, or just architecturally wise doesn't make sense. You can absolutely do that. I'm still unable to share my screen, which is going to be a problem.
And I'll tell folks the use case that I use the SDK a lot for is particularly the ASP.NET integration. Whenever I'm doing, pub sub subscriptions and things of that nature, the feature to be able to just annotate those things and be able to plug into dependency injection and stuff like that is super useful. Like that's a big use case for me. What about you?
So, yeah, I may have to try and
restart.
Just
yeah, just disconnect and connect again. That's totally fine. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Usually it works, right?
Okay.
All IT solutions just like turn it off and on again, right? So yeah.
Okay. But yeah, Mark, I was gonna ask you, like, so I know you do a little bit of .NET. Like, what are some of the things that you've used the .NET SDK for Dapr?
I think I have touched most of the different APIs now with .NET. Still not everything. The thing what was most real, I definitely did a lot of workflow stuff recently, but also actors as well. So that's also a very nice part to use and to see how it works. And I also tried the different ways how you can actually interact with those actor proxies, right? So the strongly typed way, which is possible in .NET, but also the loosely typed way. So yeah, it's definitely nice that you have all of these different options, and I do actually like it that it's also the libraries are also fine-grained, right? So you don't have to take a dependency on everything, so you don't have to import or add a dependency to this huge package that contains everything. I mean, you could also think that maybe it's like very simple to have just one package that contains all, but it also means that you will have a lot of code or part of your dependency which you're probably not using. So I think I prefer this more fine-grained solution, so you only pick and choose what you actually are using. I think that makes more sense. Because some people don't really like to have like dependencies in general, right? So some organizations are really like picky on which dependencies you can actually start using. So I think it's beneficial that we have defined grained ones, and even if you don't want to use them at all, then it's also still possible to use many of the APIs. I mean, if you, for instance, for actors and workflows, then you still need to create a workflow, and you need to create actor definitions, and those things you can only do with the SDKs. But interacting with workflows and interacting with actors, those doesn't require the SDKs. So that's actually good to know. Yeah.
You know, as you're talking just now, I was just thinking, I think the one part of the API that I haven't touched yet is the actor stuff. I haven't touched that at all,
Yeah.
to be honest with you. But I also feel like I haven't had a use case to use it yet, right?
Yeah, it is quite. It's a bit niche, right? Although I do hear quite some companies are actually using it in production. So also recently, I'm still working on a Dapr client case study that will be published on the CNCF website, and then those are also like big users of Dapr actors. So it's good to know that it's actually being used in production. Yeah, but you don't hear it that often, to be honest.
Yeah. I think too, because of the types of applications I'm usually building, that's not really like actors is, because again, it's the use case, right? Like you don't use everything for everything.
Yeah.
I think I was doing things like building games. I bring up building games only because I know I've seen you building games recently.
Yeah,
you
true.
know, building games, fleet tracking,
lots of IoT applications you need.
Right. Yeah, things where you're tracking devices, tracking like these little units of users or entities like moving around the screen. Like I think actors are a really good option for that type of stuff for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, I definitely did like a couple of so I didn't use it in production myself, but I did create some content around it. Also gave a lot of sessions now about actors, and I do like the programming model. And especially if you're already using Dapr and you want to have some kind of actor model, then it's probably like a no-brainer to actually start using the Dapr the actors if you already use that. If you don't have Dapr, then the Dapr actor is probably not your first choice, because of course there are like many different actor frameworks. So probably it might not be your first choice to go for the Dapr one, since Dapr itself is already really quite broad.
Yeah,
and it can offer many things. But I definitely like it. But I also I use a lot of the pops up, of course, and state management, secrets as well, the external configuration, which I also like. In general, the API is really quite accessible for me.
Hey, Philip, welcome back.
Hey, well, I'm sort of back.
Let's see what the screen sharing does.
All right, let's see what happens.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's see if this will do it.
Yeah, we have a screen.
Okay, that's better. Let's go ahead. All right. So sorry about that. So it's what I was trying to get to anyway. Was here is VS Code open to a clone of the Dapr.net SDK repo. All of the interesting stuff is all in the source directory. As I mentioned, the primary piece of the Dapr SDK is the Dapr.client. It's kind of the foundation of everything, and in particular, the Dapr client type itself. This is an abstract type that basically defines all of the methods that are part of the main interaction with the Dapr sidecar. So that's how you do service invocation, how you do pub sub, and so on. The reason why it's abstract is because historically there were two ways that you can interact with the Dapr sidecar. I mean, technically, there still are two ways in general to interact with it, either through HTTP or through gRPC. And there was a separate implementation of Dapr client for HTTP and for gRPC. we and so you'd make a choice kind of as you made use of the SDK, which one you wanted to use. Sometimes it was sort of implied based on environment variables that were set, either the gRPC endpoint or the HTTP endpoint, and then the SDK would infer which one you wanted to use. At some point, it became difficult to manage both independent implementations, and that there are certain calls and communication patterns with the Dapr sidecar that made it difficult to either do, say, using the HTTP-based client. And so there was a decision to sort of merge the two a little bit, and basically go forward with just the gRPC implementation. And again, depending on which call you make, sometimes you still end up using HTTP. In particular, if there are methods for creating HTTP clients that are sort of specialized for making use of the Dapr sidecar, for example, allowing you to make calls as if you were just using the standard HTTP client, which is useful if you have existing applications that you don't necessarily want to embed the use of the Dapr client throughout your application if they're already making use of HTTP client. And then it does some translation to take calls to a particular endpoint, say a service A endpoint that you're using in your HTTP client instance, and then automatically sort of redirect them through the Dapr sidecar by applying a transformation to the endpoint to make it sure that that call actually gets routed to the sidecar instead, which can be useful in certain cases. So that's why we see there's just the Dapr client gRPC implementation right now. And so we won't go too far since we've lost a little bit of time. I want to make sure that we get to the second piece. So let me bring up the slide deck. If I can get back to it. All right. So in terms of contributing to the .NET SDK, it's fairly straightforward. Install the latest Dapr CLI and runtime. Today, that's Dapr 1.13. Install the latest .NET 8 SDK. That will let you target or build against all the other targets, the down-level targets of .NET that we support. Create a fork of the Dapr .NET SDK, GitHub repo, and then it's a simple .NET build, .NET test to make sure that your environment is set up correctly to build the SDK packages and then run all of the tests. Then make your changes and add tests. You can use your favorite IDE, whether it's VS Code, whether it's Visual Studio or anything else. There's solution files that you can use that make that easy in some of the other IDEs, and then submit a PR back to the master branch of the Dapr.NET SDK repo. Ideally, that would be also referencing some existing issue related to an issue or a bug or some feature that you're implementing and so on. That's generally preferred. All right, so that's kind of a more brief introduction to the SDK than I would have preferred. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I want to make sure that we have time to get to the next piece of it.
No, that's fine. And I guess one quick question I'd love to ask about the SDK. So for folks that are new and they wanted to get involved with Dapr and even just contribute to the SDK, I'm guessing we have contribution guidelines, like folks could go in and look at issues and things of that nature, suggest features if they wanted to.
Absolutely. It's an OSS product, which means we accept contributions and we welcome them. So by all means, go to the issues. We try to mark them up as, and categorize them, including issues that are good for first-time contributors and so on and so forth. Sometimes there's easy, docs issues or just little things here and there that can be fixed or changed or added. By all means, take a look, see what looks interesting. If you have ideas of your own, of things you'd like to see in the SDK, there's always new things to do, new patterns to add, and so on. Submit issues for though with with your ideas, suggestions, proposals for new APIs, and so on, and then get in touch with myself or the other maintainer is Hal, also at Microsoft on my team. We're pretty much always on the Dapr Discord channel, so you can get in touch with us, and the .NET SDK channel or the tooling channel, whichever is easiest or makes the most sense. And we can have a discussion about it, and then decide, does it make sense? When does it make sense? Who does it make sense to have do it in terms of how large it is and how best to break it down into pieces that you might be able to contribute yourself, if that's possible, or just get items added onto the backlog for things you'd like to see in future versions. So by all means, do that. Even take existing issues, and if they're interesting to you, or if you think you can provide a fix, go ahead and do that, and we'll review it, and so on. So the bar is pretty low in terms of what it takes to actually contribute. I think there's only one real piece that you have to deal with in terms of making sure you have a valid sign-off. That's all spelled out in the contributing guidelines in the repo.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Great.
makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks,
The only
Phil.
thing I still want to add here, that if you see an issue that you want to work on, you can actually self-assign the issue. So there is a Dapr bot on GitHub. So you can actually write a comment with a / and then say assign, and then the Dapr bot will assign the issue to you. So that's probably important to know. Cool. All right.
So let's go ahead and move on to Visual Studio and Dapr. So I've done a presentation before in a previous community call, that kind of giving a preview of a new extension for using Dapr in Visual Studio. So just wanted to give kind of an update to that, and another demo of how that works. So let me bring up. There we go. All right, let's see. There we go. That's better. All right. So we're talking about the Visual Studio Dapr extension. This is something that's in preview today. The objective of this extension was to sort of bring first-class support to Dapr, or for Dapr in Visual Studio, and for the most part, provide parity with what we already have in VS Code. So Dapr has an extension for VS Code. It's been there for over 2 years now, that provides sort of a basic debugging experience, and some other UX around use of Dapr. And we want something similar for those that are using or more comfortable with Visual Studio. So this initial release focused on primarily that debugging experience, so that you can just as easily hit F5 debug as you can in VS Code. And then the intent was subsequent releases would focus more on sort of Dapr specific UX, being able to expose running Dapr services, and interact with those in a more integrated and graphical way, similar to what we do today in VS Code, but then even hopefully going further with some additional features. This was published in Visual Studio Marketplace in January of this year. Originally, it was only published through a private feed that you had to go and configure and add, but now we're in the marketplace. So all you need to do to use it is use the latest Visual Studio 2022. It's 17.9. I think the current is 17.9.7. Use either ARM64 or AMD64. I'm going to demonstrate it in particular in parallels on my Mac because that's handy. And then using Dapr version 1.11 or later. One note with that is that if you're using version 1.11, that was before run files had native Windows support in Dapr. And so the Visual Studio extension will actually sort of mimic the way that run files works. But if you're using version 1.12 of Dapr, then you can use sort of the native run file support. So it will behave a little bit more closely, or it will behave exactly like Dapr run files behaves, as opposed to sort of trying to mimic how it works. One note that while the VS Code Dapr extension is OSS, at the moment the Visual Studio Dapr extension is not, just a management and business and for historical reasons. It's not at the moment. So we still have a GitHub repo for submitting issues, getting feedback, having discussions about the extension, but at the moment we don't host the code itself. But the extension itself is offered in the marketplace, just like any other extension. All right. So some of the features that the Dapr extension in VS supports: allows you to scaffold Dapr run files for existing projects. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Add some basic IntelliSense to Dapr run file and component YAML, just to make things a little bit easier to author YAML in VS. Obviously, there's more we could do there. The primary thing is being able to automatically start Dapr sidecars and then auto attach the debugger to all of the running .NET processes. So you could just hit F5, you can start up your whole orchestrated application, have all the processes attached to the debugger, and then set breakpoints and run. And then when you're done debugging, everything goes away, Dapr sidecars get cleaned up, and you're back to where you started. So you don't have this constant back and forth between terminal windows trying to start sidecars and their processes, and then attaching them manually in VS, which can sometimes be tedious. One of the things we wanted to do is support multiple launch configurations. So just like with VS Code, you have separate launch configurations and launch.json. VS will actually share those exact same launch configurations. So you want to have multiple run files that sort of support different subsets of your application services, because maybe it just takes too long to spin a dozen different services up when maybe only you need 6 of them or something like that. You can set up multiple configurations and then allow you to choose different run files for each one, or use the same run files but then include or exclude different subsets of services that get attached to the debugger. If you're only interested in debugging only a couple of services and you don't really want to have to worry about breakpoints, stopping, and things like that in the other services in the debugger. And then also if you want to configure a browser to open to a particular service endpoint, and then you can configure it in a way that you don't have to worry about matching ports and things like that. Another feature is one place to look for all of your Dapr logs. So just one output window that includes all of the logs for all of the Dapr sidecar processes. And then there is some limited support for, say, running your applications and run files in WSL, because for whatever reason you prefer to run the applications themselves under Linux rather than under native Windows. So we support that as well. All right, so let's take a look at using Dapr run files in Visual Studio. All right, so here's Visual Studio. Minimize that for right now. All right, I've got an application solution open that makes use of Dapr. It's one that we use, or I've used in a number of different places. It's a very basic application. You got service A, which talks to service B over through service invocation. It caches the results of those calls that it makes to service B in a Dapr state store for, I think the period is about a minute. And so that if you make subsequent invocations of service A, it actually won't go to service B. It'll keep going to service A. Or it just will pull the results back out of the state store. So it's kind of a stereotypical Dapr application that uses a couple different pieces. Uses service invocation, Dapr state store, and Dapr pub sub.
And hey, Philip, whenever you get a second, could you make the font size a little bit bigger?
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah,
let's see if I can do that reasonably easy in VS. Let's increase this a bit. All right, I'll at least increase some of the pieces.
That's
hopefully
that's
a
better.
little bit better.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
right. Yeah, so we've got our projects here, Dapr Service A. If we go and look at it, you can see if you call it, it uses Dapr State Store, uses the Dapr client, which is injected via dependency injection to get the current state, cache state if it exists. If it does exist, it will return that cached value. Otherwise, it makes this Dapr service invocation to service B's endpoint, and then stores the result in the state store, and then returns the result. So we've got two services that we might like to debug with. You can see we've got a dapr.yaml that's up here. Because we have a dapr.yaml, that's sort of the trigger for Visual Studio to identify this particular solution as one which is sort of making use of Dapr. And so it will create this new Dapr project as part of the solution. This is a virtual project, so it doesn't actually correspond to a CS proj or Dapr proj or anything like that, which is something that we've heard lots of feedback about with respect to other tooling, Docker tooling, and so on, that a lot of users don't want to see all of these extra assets that are sort of Visual Studio specific in their repo. And so we try to make everything sort of triggered based on assets that you actually would have, but not introduce new ones. So by virtue of having a dapr.yaml in your root solution folder, we recognize the solution as being sort of Daprized. So we'll add a project. Because we've added this project to the solution, it allows the Dapr extension to sort of contribute and participate in the debugging process. So that allows us to make it the startup project. We can then choose from one of our launch configurations. Here I have one that launches the browser. Here's one that only debugs or only attaches to service A, even though both service A and service B are getting started. And so we can go ahead and start. You can see Dapr is starting up. You can see the Dapr output window, just starting up Dapr. And if we are lucky, we will, things will start and things will attach.
You know, what I like about this is, you know, I think about how hard it is for me sometimes to debug just in general, particularly things that are running in containers. And traditionally, how I've debugged Dapr is like, I'll spit up a Docker Compose file, right? And I'll, you know, whatever tool I'm using, I'll debug into the container. But it looks like you're able to do this just running processes on your machine, right? Which for me already removes a layer of work that I have to do, right? Just to kind of get my, you know, my dev flow going locally on my machine.
Yeah, I mean, nothing stops you. If you're more comfortable with using Docker Compose, you can use the existing Docker Compose tooling to in Visual Studio. I was actually on the team that owned that previously. To run your Docker Compose that starts up your applications and starts up all of the Dapr sidecars. You can configure all that if that's what you're more comfortable with, and if you are, then absolutely use that. And you can achieve a lot of the same goals. But as you start adding more and more services to your larger application, your larger orchestration, it gets more and more complex to wire all of that together. And so it can get a little tedious to manage. And sometimes you just don't want to have to deal with all these other stuff. You just want kind of BS. Sometimes you just want to have the magic happen, right? Be able to hit F5 and have everything start up and run and just hit your breakpoint, because that's really what you're interested in doing.
Yeah, that's very true.
So here we got, we're now running our applications in the debugger. It's launched the browser to Service A's Swagger endpoint. You can go back and see we're actually attached to both Service A and Service B. You can see in our Dapr output window, here's a bunch of output. We're actually running the run files directly, so that output is actually getting written to a separate log file in this particular case. But if you're using, say, Dapr 1.11, then you'll actually see the full logs here. Let's go ahead and try hitting our endpoint. Here we go. Now we're in Service A. There's Service A. We can continue. Now we're in Service B, which ultimately returns the value. So now we've seen that we can debug into both processes seamlessly. Now we get our response back. We'll go ahead and try it again. In this case, we'll hit Service A again as we expect, but the value should be cached now in the Dapr state store, which was set up. You can see now we didn't hit our breakpoint in service B because we're using the cache result instead. So that's sort of like the end-to-end demonstration of how we can, debug against the real, services that are in our Dapr run file. We can go back and take a look at that. Here's our Dapr run file against real Dapr components, which were specified in the run file as well. And see the results just like running any other process in VS. All right. So a couple of things that I wanted to point out. Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and stop, which will shut everything back down. Is we have support for editing Dapr run files or Dapr component, both run file YAML. You can see we get a little bit of IntelliSense, which can be a little bit helpful when you're authoring things, but also in the component YAML as well. It's not in everyone. I don't know why. Let's try this one. There we go. Some IntelliSense to help you sort of fill out these component YAMLs. And then, as I mentioned, we support multiple launch configurations. So here's one configuration where we can say, I'm only interested in debugging service A. So now if we run, we should attach to just that process. So we've run again, the sidecars have started, we're attaching to things. And all right. Nope, that didn't work. Well, maybe show that later. All right. So we showed the different launch configuration. We can actually edit that. That opens up the launch.json. This is actually in the VS Code folder. So if we open VS Code to the same folder, we'd be able to make use of those same assets so that we can reuse the same configuration between both IDEs. So if you're shifting between them, or if you're a team that kind of oscillates between using VS Code or VS, depending on each individual team member, you should be able to make use of the same assets. All right. Some of those are some of those pieces. And that's kind of where the bulk of the features for this initial release of Visual Studio extension for Dapr are. As I said, we'd like to be able to do more. Obviously, that all has to fit into all of the other things that our team is responsible for. So sometimes those things are slower in coming than other things. All right, so we have any questions about that so far?
No, not so far. Yeah, I really love how it's kind of pushing the narrative of using that Dapr.yaml file to, like, again, orchestrate and run these things locally. I think that's one of the features, to be honest with you, that a lot of people don't know that Dapr has, particularly when it comes to like debugging your applications. So I definitely appreciate that about it. Are there any specific features in the SDK, in the extension, that are related to deployments? Like, can I, is this going to help me, deploy to Azure, deploy to Kubernetes, or anything of the sort? Or is this solely an extension for like local debugging?
So at the moment, the target was really for that developer inner loop experience. So being able to get your things started, the sidecars started, your applications attached. So you can hit your breakpoints, test your app, and then be done, and then have everything cleaned up. That's really the target. So there's nothing specific at the moment related to deploying through or somehow using the Dapr run files. But what I can do is, and also what I wanted to kind of, as we get towards the end of my, where did my presentation go?
You might have minimized it, I think.
Somehow I lost my presentation. Interesting. Oh, there it is. There it went. All right, so something always comes up when we talk about the Visual Studio extension, and that is that there's another extension, or I should say another feature of Visual Studio that exists today related to .NET, and that's .NET Aspire. So .NET Aspire, and so there was a lot of questions when .NET Aspire was released as a preview late last year about how that interacts with Dapr, because they sort of solve similar kinds of problems in slightly different ways. And in particular, the tooling is a bit different as well as their approach to orchestrating and startup of your applications. So just as a brief review, .NET Aspire is a new product that uses C# code to orchestrate the startup of service and dependencies. So whereas you might have a Dapr run file in Dapr, or you might have Docker Compose with YAML for Docker containers, this uses sort of more declarative C# code to build a model of your application, which is then used by other components in like Visual Studio and other runtimes to start up your orchestration. It wires together resources to simplify configuration, so you don't need to specify port numbers and things like that. Endpoints are just automatically passed through environment variables or however it's set up. It offers integrated collection of logs and metrics and traces, so everything's sort of in one spot to allow you to sort of see the health and activity of your larger application, and then exposes all of that through a single dashboard. So Visual Studio now supports this auto attach of all of these .NET processes that have been started by .NET Aspire. And then sort of the third point is that .NET Aspire shipped with Dapr Sidecar integration in its initial preview, with subsequent previews adding more, or the beginnings of sort of more component level support. And so this question comes up as well. We just talked about using Dapr run files to debug your application. Which should we use?
Sorry.
It's all right. And the answer is that you can use either or both. Whichever best fits your particular purpose, fits your particular developer workflow. Do that, right? There's advantages to either approach, and they kind of came about sort of at the same time in parallel. And so there definitely feels like maybe there's a little bit of overlap, and that's true in the case of Visual Studio. But one thing I wanted to do is just briefly show how that differs in terms of the Visual Studio experience from what we showed before in Visual Studio. So we'll go back to our solution, and as you know, if you've noticed, there's this Dapr app host. So this is the Aspire host for the larger application. So this defines the orchestration or builds the model that is used to start the larger applications. So you can see that we're creating a distributed application. We're adding some things like we want to add a Dapr state store, but we don't particularly care what kind of state store it is, because for the most part, our applications don't care whether it's Redis, whether it's Azure Key Vault, whether it's some other thing, SQL or whatever. We just want a state store. And so the Dapr integration with Aspire can manage that and automatically generate an appropriate component configuration for a state store that fits that purpose, or for Dapr pub sub if that's what we want. And then we can say, okay, we'll add our project. We want to add a Dapr sidecar to it, and then we want to reference the components that sidecar and project make use of, the state store in the pub sub, or in the case of server speed, only makes use of pub sub, and then we can run it. Right. So running it is similar. We'll just make the active project the .NET Aspire app host. You can go and run. And it will do, it's not based on run files. It's actually starting an individual sidecar for each one. But the effect is much the same. Right. So you can see it's running the app host. You can see now it started Dapr Service A, Dapr Service B. We can go back here. Here's our Dapr dashboard. You can see that the sidecars are running. You can see their endpoints, our services are running. And so we can do similar things like execute that endpoint. Now we're back in our debugger, right? So there's really, there's Visual Studio provides sort of several ways to run and debug your application with Dapr, just depending on what best fits your needs. Whether it's useful to use .NET Aspire, say because you have a bunch of different dependencies that you also want to spin up. That's sort of like one of the limitations of Dapr run files. Is Dapr run files are very specific to, I can start your individual services, but if you have other dependencies that you need to spin up, I need to spin up a SQL container or a Redis container and so on and so forth. It's kind of left to the user to do that independently of the run file. But you can do that with .NET Aspire. So if you already have all this stuff typically running, often you have a Redis container already running as part of your Dapr initialization, so you typically have kind of a state store running for free, then maybe run files is a better fit. Or if, say, you're using Visual Studio Code, kind of and shift between them, maybe Dapr run files are a better overall fit than, say, using Aspire. But again, it really just depends on what your individual needs are, what best fits your developer workflow. Use whichever one makes sense. And obviously, if there are things that you want in either .NET integration or either Dapr integration with .NET Aspire or Dapr integration with VS, file issues, provide feedback in the Dapr Discord channel, and let us know what it is you want. All right.
Awesome.
So I think I'm
Thanks,
well
Philip.
out of time.
Appreciate it, man. I think that was great, man. I think
Thanks,
you got a
Philip.
really good perspective on the extension and also the .NET SDK as well for Dapr. So yeah, definitely appreciate you coming on and talking to us about it.
Yeah, it's also good to know that you have options, right? In when it comes to Visual Studio, so either the extension or you use Aspire. So yeah, it's good to be aware of this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, and then if people are interested in contributing to the .NET SDK, please have a look at the repo. We shared a link in the chat. Have a look through the issues. There are a couple of good first issues also there, I think. I will make sure, and also Cecil and also Anu, the other community manager, will actually make sure that we actually create some more good first issues to make it even easier for everyone to contribute. All right. So there are two questions, but one is related. They're both not related to either the .NET SDK or the extension. I could still show them, right? So Simon's asking from the question for later, maybe. Yes, how's the Dapr and CNCF graduation review going? As far as I've understood, the CNCF has really quite a backlog of all of the projects they are reviewing for graduation, because quite a lot of projects have submitted a proposal for graduation. So I don't think the Dapr project is now being actually reviewed right now. So I think we're still in the backlog of to be reviewed. So it's still ongoing. But yeah, when it's actually being reviewed, or when we're nearly there, we're definitely going to mention during this community call about the status. And of course, when it's happened, because I think we did. I think it will happen this year. I think that's the only thing that was mentioned, but we don't have a real timeline. So, but we'll definitely keep you up to date to that, Simon. And Johan mentioned about the state store. This is definitely true, right? So the state store query support really differs between which underlying component, state store component you're using. So there's only a limited amount of state stores that supports querying. And then to be very transparent, so the query API is like alpha, and it's also very likely that it will not progress beyond alpha, because there are some new proposals regarding different kinds of state stores, which makes it more suitable for querying. So it's very likely that query will stay in alpha support. And that Dapr is looking into different state stores outside of key value pair, right? So also like a NoSQL one and a SQL one. But that's still unplanned, definitely being spoken about. So also not anything that we can give a timeline for, but it's definitely being discussed. All right, I suggest we move on to the next final section. So thank you very much, Philip.
Mm-hmm.
I will share my screen again, and we'll do the show and tell. And here we go, this one. All right. And we also see like a nice blue cross here. Let's actually not do that and move this back. So I have this new gadget, which is like a teleprompter. So I was sharing that teleprompter screen, so that actually that blue cross was actually where my camera is behind the mirror. But I'm actually so it's probably not best to share it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that cross behind that cross there's the exact lens of
Nice.
where it should look into. So, but apparently not the best to share that. All right, let's share this again. And we'll make it quick to also respect everyone's time because we're already at the hour. Here we go. So the community show and tell round, there are 2 blog posts. One is actually a Chinese translation of a blog post written by Mauricio Salatino, also known as Salaboy, and it's about building a multilingual or polyglot developer experience for 2024. So if your first language is Chinese, this is probably the article for you to read. The other one is an article by Bilgen Ibriam comparing Dapr developer tools for efficient development. And so also indeed the extension we just talked about is part of this this blog post. So it covers like 2 different sides of it, right? So we talk about the inner development loop, which some tools which are very relevant for Dapr, and also the outer development loop. So definitely have a look into that as well. Then there are a couple of videos. So Microsoft published this video about creating truly portable applications using Dapr and Radius. And also this presentation was given a couple of community calls back. But again, definitely have a look at this video. Then Victor Varchik gave this session about unleashing the power of serverless on Kubernetes, which is like a combination of different open source tools, including Dapr. Then there was a session during a Global Azure Day given by Tal Cohen about Dapr on Azure. Have a look at that. And then what we found on Twitter, different posts. So of course my face is there because I attended a AI community day in the Netherlands. I wasn't speaking there, but it was definitely nice to engage with the community and definitely shared a lot of Dapr stickers. Mauricio Salatino I think it was today. It's today and tomorrow. The KCD Istanbul, so Community Days Istanbul, giving a session about Dapr there. And the people at the Engine are continuously writing some Dapr blog posts, so that was also shared. And Mark Muller spoke at Tegorama, I think that was last week in Belgium, about .NET microservices with Dapr. So thank you for that, Mark. And my colleague Kendall Roden is at MS Build, and that's happening next year. So yeah, if you want to talk about Dapr, definitely talk to her. Then what we found on LinkedIn, a couple of people just sharing some Dapr love, some Dapr knowledge. So Donald Lutz shared the Dapr Quick Starts repo. So yeah, that's the go-to repo I also recommend if you're not familiar with Dapr yet, but want to do some kind of hands-on coding or just see how it works. Definitely have a look at the Dapr Quick Starts. And then Dan Kida also shared indeed that he's really that Dapr is really like a prominent centerpiece in their code. It's always good to hear. Eduard Keilholz shared his blog post about Dapr, and I think this was combined with Azure Container Apps. And finally, Matheus Cruz said a thank you about a Dapr swag package that he received some time ago. As a reminder, if you are writing Dapr blog posts or giving Dapr presentations, you can actually get these badges by writing an entry in a table in the Dapr community repo. So if you're writing or presenting, definitely have to look at the Dapr community repo, make a PR there, and then one of the community managers will actually mention you in the PR when we merge this, and then you can claim these 2 badges. And finally, by you being here, you probably are a Dapr supporter. So if you've not claimed this badge yet, feel free to scan this QR code. And please share it also on socials. It's always nice to see these posts on either X or on LinkedIn. All right. And with that, we have concluded this community call. It's now 1 hour and 4 minutes, so we're definitely a bit over time. But thanks for joining us. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Bye-bye.